Warm welcome to today's talk. It's Wednesday, the 16th of March. Now, what I want to do is really point out the need I feel now to move much more towards natural immunity, because we are basically endemic now. Now, we can't say we're fully in the endemic stage of this pandemic yet, because it's not yet fully predictable. Or at least with endemicity, we would expect more predictability, but we're pretty well getting there. And this virus is going to be with us for several years, perhaps several decades. We don't really know, but in the long term, medium to long term. And that means we're all going to be exposed to this virus. I see no way around that at all. Now, my thinking started on this with this article here that I read, just in the popular press. Scotland, mask mandates. So Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, just decided it's prudent to have mandatory mask rules until the 4th of April at the earliest. So mandatory mask wearing in public areas in Scotland for at least another 2 or 3 weeks, whereas in England we're not. But let's carry on. Mask rules, case numbers well ahead of England. So even though they've got these mask rules, and they've had tighter rules in Scotland now for some time compared to England, really, for some weeks, they're getting many more cases, because it seems to me that in Scotland they're missing the opportunity to acquire natural, in most cases, post-vaccination immunity. But why do they not seem to get this? Now, let's look at the figures to support this. Now, this is the latest from the Office for National Statistics. So we can be sure of these figures. These are as accurate as we get. England, it's 1 in 25 people currently. Well, this is the week before. It's always a week out of date, of course. Prevalence currently infected with the virus, 1 in 25 people currently infected. Wales, slightly lower, 1 in 30. Northern Ireland, 1 in 13, so more people there. But Scotland is 1 in 18. So if we can compare England with very low levels of restriction, where I would assume we are experiencing and generating natural immunity much quicker, compared to Scotland, where the prevalence is much higher. So prima facie evidence from this temporal correlation would suggest that this prudent approach is actually not working particularly well, because we're moving into the endemic period. Now, what I just flashed up there by mistake, but I'm put it on deliberately now. This is from Medscape, and this is an article which is basically arguing for that. So I want to sort of critique this a bit now. COVID-19, why are we ignoring infection-acquired immunity? Because we are. Why is this happening? Now, I think I know part of the answer to this. Part of the answer, I'm not saying it's all the answer, but part of the answer is governments still want to encourage as much vaccination as possible. And I think that if governments feel they introduce nuance into this, then the public are so stupid that they won't understand. Well, I don't think you're stupid, and I want the full facts so I can make decisions. We need to move away from this one-size-fits-all strategy, and that's what I'm going to be giving evidence for. We need to individualise the care that we're giving people. So this article from Medscape, antibodies from natural infection are more abundant and more potent, at least 10 times more potent than immunity generated by vaccine alone, according to this Medscape article. And as I said, we will be critiquing this, so we will be giving further evidence that does support the accuracy of what this article is actually saying. It's actually quite a nice article. I've put the link in, of course. Completely accessible. Do flick on that. You can read through it in 5 minutes. And it really does make a lot of what some governments are doing look a bit, well, let's be kind and say dated, shall we? A little bit dated. 10 times more potent than immunity generated by vaccine alone. Now, we needed the vaccinations to give us the immunity to enjoy as we're exposed to natural infection, because we're much less likely to get sick and much less likely to die and get hospitalised. But now that I've got immunity from vaccination and that is waning, I believe it's in my interests to be exposed to the natural infection now as soon as possible. Now, I can't tell you what to do, but this is what makes sense to me, and this is what is consistent. That's what makes sense for me personally, but this is consistent with this thinking that we're looking at here. Now, we've had this idea of hybrid immunity, which is supposed to be a sort of super immunity. So the hybrid immunity, of course, is if you've had the vaccine and you've had the infection, you're supposed to be super immune. But the data isn't really showing that. The data is showing that if you've had the natural infection, if you have vaccination as well, it doesn't really help that much. It's the natural infection which is the key thing. So the hybrid immunity is good in the short term. So we can get. So I want to get infected with the natural variant while I'm still protected with vaccine, rather than when my vaccine protection is worn off, and that will give me hybrid immunity. But it looks like it's the natural infection that's giving the longer term immunity, irrespective of whether infection came first or the vaccine came first. Now, we did think at first there was data that showed if you were vaccinated and then had the infection, you had good levels of immunity. But it seems to work the other way around. So whether you're infection first, then vaccine, or whether you're vaccine first, then immunity, then the natural infection, it doesn't really seem to make much difference. But if you have the vaccine as well, it doesn't really add that much to the natural immunity, is what this data seems to be showing. There's an increased evidence that immunity derived from natural infection with COVID-19 gives powerful protection. And the thing to underline there is on its own. On its own. So that is basically the thrust of this article. Let's just look at a couple of more things it says. Natural immunity has been shown to be both highly protective and long-lasting. So it looks like we're getting better longevity from natural immunity, from natural infection. And natural infection safeguards against both reinfection and severe disease, as does vaccination in the short term. But we believe the evidence is starting to emerge now that the natural immunity is giving more longevity. So that is the kind of main thrust of that article. So I wanted to check it out. So I went to this one first of all, from Science Immunology. Vaccination before or after SARS coronavirus 2 leads to robust humoral. Now, the humoral immunity is the immunity in the body fluids. That's basically the antibody immunity. But of course, you and I know the cellular immunity as well, which is the B and the T lymphocytes, which generate longer-lived immunity as well as this. But they're harder to study. So a lot of the studies are still looking at antibodies, which, to be fair, antibodies show whether we've had the vaccination, or they show whether we've had the vaccination, or whether we've had the natural infection. So the antibodies are proxy of infection. And if we've got the antibodies, that means we've had the infection or the vaccination, and that means the B and the T cells have been stimulated for the longer-lived immunity. So the antibodies are a useful proxy. That is fair. And they're also useful. I'm not poo-pooing antibodies by any means. This is from Oregon Health and Science University. So I'm not poo-pooing antibodies, but they're by no means the whole story. That's what I've tried to say rather badly just then. Antibody responses from the initial wave of vaccines in early 2021 have waned over 6 months. So we're getting waning of vaccine efficacy, contributing to increasing breakthrough infections, partly why we've got so many breakthrough infections. So again, in this study, what they did was that these authors, that's these people here, these ones here, they say this. We measured neutralizing antibody responses, those with breakthrough infections. So they measured people with hybrid immunity, people with no infection history, but often vaccinated. And so they were able to compare them. So those with breakthrough infection, so they could compare these different groups, which is a fairly standard research technique. And we find that in human immune sera, that's basically the humoral part where the antibodies will be in the blood. After breakthrough infection and vaccination, after natural infection, broadly neutralised variants to a similar degree. So these people here have had infection and vaccination, and because they've had breakthrough infection, that means they've had the vaccination first. But if we compare these people with these who've just had the natural infection without the vaccination, then they actually do much the same, indicating to me the superiority of the immune response generated by natural infection compared to vaccination. Now, again, this is not saying vaccination is not important, because when I'm exposed to the natural variant, I want to have the protection from vaccines while I'm generating the natural immunity. Otherwise, we'd have a situation where we had way back in the dark days of the alpha wave, where a lot of people were getting sick. So the vaccines have been good for a period of time, but is it time now to move on to natural immunity from vaccination? I think for most people, that is going to be true. It's not an anti-vax message, it's a vax at the right time message, and a natural immunity at the right time message. The message which was true 12 months ago is no longer true now. Situation has changed. It's pretty obvious, really, but governments don't seem to realise very often. Broadly neutralising variants to a similar degree. So this, whether you've had breakthrough infection after the vaccine or whether you've just had natural infection, you've basically got roughly the same levels of protection. Now, age negatively correlated with antibody response over vaccination alone. In other words, older people do not respond to the vaccine as well as younger people. Simple statement, that. Older, and of course we know this from many other vaccinations. The older you are, the crummier your immune system is, basically. You don't respond as well. So younger people are producing better humoral antibody response, and therefore presumably T and B cell response as well, compared to older people. That's pretty straightforward. So the vaccinations aren't working as well in the elderly